In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. At the beginning of the film, The Man for All Seasons, about the life of Thomas More, Thomas More is summoned by Cardinal Wolsey to the palace of Hampton Court and asked why he has refused to support Cardinal Wolsey in his attempt to get a divorce for the king. And Thomas More says he doesn't think that this is correct, and it's a matter for the Holy See. And so the cardinal says, a matter of conscience. And then he proceeds to give him a lecture about policy and how following his conscience is going to lead to bad policy for Thomas More. And Thomas More says this: I believe that when statesmen forsake their public duty, their private conscience, for the sake of their public duty, they lead their country on a short route to chaos. This film is all about the primacy of conscience. This problem is a problem which is an especially difficult one and an especially important one for Catholic moral teaching. Its importance really began after the Council of Trent. For those of you who may know something about the history of philosophy, in the 16th century, because of a philosopher named René Descartes, there was a great deal of difficulty in determining the certainty of human knowledge. And since conscience is human knowledge about what we should do, this right and wrong, the attempt to discover certainty in this regard, in a sense, you could say, became top-heavy in Catholic moral teaching. For any people who have studied the history of moral theology and Catholicism in the 17th and 18th century, they had all these schools from probabilism to equiprobabilism to how much you had to be certain in order to make your judgment and conscience about right and wrong and things like that. It's not only been a problem for the time after the Council of Trent, but it's also become a problem in the post-Vatican II Church. And the reason is because there was a whole school of moral theology that grew up in the post-Vatican II Church that was based on the writings of a Jesuit named Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner, in one of his articles, maintained that there were two systems of ethics. The first system was what he called, in very academic terminology, material essentialist ethics. These would be the laws, because these are universal statements. Thou shalt not, thou shalt, etc. All right? Papal teachings and certain things. These were to guide our choices concerning right and wrong. But this system was insufficient in order for us to make a true judgment about what we should do in practice here and now. And so Karl Rahner, for the first time in Catholic history, developed a second system of ethics, which was different than the first system of ethics, and he called this, in this article of his, again, this is academic terminology, formal existential ethics, as opposed to material essentialist ethics. What does he mean by formal existential ethics? He means that when an individual is making a choice about right and wrong, especially about something really important, in his conscience, that the universal ideas of the first system of ethics are things he should consult. But in addition to this, he has to obey the rules for discernment of spirits in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in every single moral choice that he makes. And in theory, this discernment might lead him to decide that the Holy Spirit is telling him in his conscience to do something which is contrary to the universal teaching. Now, okay, I explain this in a very academic way. Let me give you an example. Paul VI says in Humani Vitae, each and every marital act must remain open to the transmission of life. A person who was following this distinction that Karl Rahner made, and believe me, this distinction was highly influential in Catholic moral teaching. Any of you who've been to university or seminaries in the last 40 years have heard of a system called consequentialism that basically ran supreme in teaching people about morals. And this was based in this theory. Okay, he should read the papal document, he should listen to it. Then, in his own conscience, he should ask the Holy Spirit if in his situation it wasn't more life-affirming to practice contraception. And in theory, the Holy Spirit certainly could tell him that it was. So in other words, what this system was saying is that no universal statement concerning the moral law can cover every individual instance in morals. And because conscience is never just an application of the universal law to an individual action, something which Karl Rahner actually says, that as a result, the question of the formation of conscience cannot end with a papal teaching, for instance, concerning contraception. Now, though it's true that there's some uncertainty in morals, because you can't take account of every single circumstance that could ever present itself, especially in the framing of laws, especially human laws. This is something that Catholic moral theology has known for centuries. It's not quite the same as to say that a norm, that there's no universal norms, and especially that there's no moral absolutes when it comes to things that are absolutely evil. For example, to say that abortion is always wrong, that's a universal statement. But a person might discern through the Holy Spirit's action in their particular frame of reference that it's more life-serving to have an abortion. There was a Jesuit moralist who taught that in the celebrated case, which it seems hardly ever occurs today, of the mother or the child, you know, in craniotomy, where if the woman carries the child to term, that she may die, and as a result, the doctors recommend that the child be killed. It's partial birth abortion, basically, in order to save the mother's life. That if the mother had 6 children, and they go through these unbelievable circumstantial additions, and they all might starve if she allowed herself to die, that she could discern through the Holy Spirit that having this abortion wouldn't be wrong for her. It wouldn't really be abortion, you see. And not only that, but she may even have a moral obligation to do it. This Jesuit wrote a book called Doing Evil to Achieve Good. And it was a highly influential moral textbook. This particular moralist was the Rose Kennedy Center for Bioethics professor at Georgetown, and then he changed to be the moral theologian at Notre Dame University. So you can see this whole question of conscience is an issue, and you may also be familiar with the fact that the Canadian bishop's big solution to the question of contraception in the late 60s and early 70s was just to say, well, everybody should just be guided by their conscience. Well, I mean, what does that say? What does that mean? And today there are people who will tell you, well, I'm following my conscience. No one can criticize me, period. Now, to try to get some idea of what's good and bad in this, the first thing I think we need to do is define what conscience is. Conscience is a judgment that's present in your intelligence. It's present in your reason. As any process of reasoning and logic, it's what used to be called a syllogism. Conscience has a major statement, a minor statement, and a conclusion, in which a general relationship in the moral law is given a more specific application and then speaks to the person through the natural law or through the divine revealed law concerning what their obligation is to do something and tells them they ought to do it or not to do it. Let me give you an example. The general statement in the syllogism is something like, do good and avoid evil. Or if you're a Christian, it would be, I must obey the law of God. The minor statement would be, the killing of an innocent person is contrary to the law of God and is evil. As a result, I must not, conclusion, I must never kill an innocent human person. This description of conscience comes not only from the works of Thomas Aquinas, but is also taught in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is one of the numbers in the Catechism that describes what conscience is. The dignity of the human person implies and requires uprightness of moral conscience. Conscience includes the perception of the principles of morality, that's the general statement, do good and avoid evil, their application in given circumstances by practical discernments of reasons and goods, the killing of an innocent person is contrary to the law of God, evil, and finally judgment of a concrete acts yet to be performed or already performed. Did I kill an innocent person already? Should I kill an innocent person in the future? The acts yet to be performed would be the consequent conscience. The acts which I've already performed are what moral theologians term the antecedent conscience. Conscience can either absolve you or accuse you. A person, for example, that comes to confession and thinks they've committed a sin, and they ask the priest about this, what they're trying to do is form their conscience to decide whether what they thought was sinful really was, and sometimes, often, I mean, today, a lot of times you want to say, no, I'm sorry, that's not a sin. In a way, you don't want to say that today because so many people have lost the concept of sin. On the other hand, if you let them confess things that are silly and trivial and have nothing to do with moral law as such, as a sin, that just adds to the issue. Sometimes people will say something and I'll say, look, is that against the law of God? No. I said, well, then why are you confessing it? You know, that's the problem. So, the theoretical explanation of this teaching is very important because the conscience is the place where through reason God Himself has determined that we by our understanding will apply the truth of our human nature to our deeds. So, for example, Gaudium et Spes says this, the document of Vatican II. Deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. Its voice ever calling him to love and do what is good and to avoid evil, tells him inwardly at the right moment, do this and shun that. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. However, the fact that the conscience speaks with the voice of God does not mean it's beyond criticism or even error. John Paul II, in an encyclical he wrote in the 1990s, reflecting this moral teaching I just told you about, where you have these two systems of ethics, which was very, very prevalent in Catholic moral teaching for many years, says that today we have developed what he calls a creative understanding of moral conscience, which diverges from the teaching of the Church's tradition and her magisterium. This creative understanding precisely teaches that no general moral laws cover all cases. While such norms may be useful for a correct assessment of the situation, they cannot replace, this is his criticism, the individual personal decision on how to act in particular cases. The authors who recommend this creative understanding propose a double status of moral truth. This status I told you about, which is the status of the objective law as opposed to the proximate case of the particular case, the place where you yourself make the judgment, I should or shouldn't do this. Since conscience is a process of reasoning like any other process of reasoning, it's carried on by human beings. The reason, though it does speak with the voice of God, that we have to criticize our understanding of it, is that like any other reasoning we do, it can be mistaken. You know, a lot of us make mistakes in logic all the time. Either the premise is wrong or the way we combine the argument is wrong. And so we come to wrong conclusions. Conscience, therefore, says the Pope, is not an infallible judge. It can make mistakes. Once this fact is admitted, the whole problem arises of how it binds, therefore. It's true you have to follow the judgment of your conscience. But this statement cannot be made without important distinctions. And I'm going to try to make some distinctions for you now. Dominicans love distinctions, by the way. I remember I gave an exam once in the seminary, and I had this kid. He's a priest now. He was a fun kid. He was from Brooklyn, but he'd been trained by the Jesuits. So I got this exam back. So anyway, I graded it, and he got his paper back. He says, B+. I said, look, I didn't want Jesuit rhetoric. I wanted scholastic distinctions. So you and your darn distinctions. So every test then on, I wrote at the top, let's make some distinctions, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. How do we distinguish between how conscience binds and how it doesn't bind, and in what way it binds? All right? Again, to determine this, we have to decide what conscience is. It's a judgment of our reason about what we should do, in which the individual applies general principles of the moral law to specific actions here and now. Conscience is much like what we used to call the virtue of prudence, which is right reason applied to action. The difference between the two is that the virtue of prudence ends in you actually carrying out your judgment in your will. Conscience ends merely in the judgment of your intelligence. I must do this or must not. It's one of the reasons why you can act against your conscience. You know, your conscience can tell you that such an action is wrong, and you can still do it. Or your conscience can tell you that such an action is right, and you can omit to do it. So prudence ends in the love with which we do things. Conscience ends in our intelligent judgment about what should be done. Now, since it's sometimes difficult to know the truth in moral actions because of all the circumstances involved in making a choice, conscience is also applied as to the possibility of knowing how to use these principles. So it is that a conscience can be called, there are various kinds of conscience. There's what's called a scrupulous conscience, when a person for trivial reasons thinks everything he's done is wrong. There's a perplexed conscience, in which a person sees equal reasons for choosing or avoiding an action. A lax conscience, in which a person easily judges he has no sin based on insufficient reason. Or the Pharisaical conscience, which is the person who minimizes grave sins and maximizes trivial ones. Who, you know, swallows the camel and restrains the gnat, or something like that. And again, confessors have to deal with this all the time. The most difficult person to deal with is a person with a scrupulous conscience, because they simply don't believe you when you tell them. They want to be a sinner, and they want to go to hell, basically. I knew someone who was attacked by scruples once. He was a brother in an order, and he went to priest after priest after. He believed that if he thought about a sin, he did it. That was the same as a sin of thought. So if he watched a TV program and they committed murder on the TV show, he was a murderer. Like that, right? And he went to priest after priest after priest after priest, and they said, "You're nuts. No, you don't know. You don't know. Someone else will tell me that I'm right." People don't think you can, they don't want to listen to you if they have a scrupulous conscience. Of course, the lax conscience is what we're dealing with today. It's not uncommon. I've had people say to me, yeah, it's true I'm living with another person out of wedlock, but you know, Jesus and I are okay with each other. And I want to say, well, you're very sure of that? Oh, yes, Jesus and I are okay with each other. Right. The freedom to act on one's conscience can be compromised by the degree of the certainty of your judgment. This is commonly divided between a certain conscience, in which one firmly judges something he should do or avoid because he understands the reasons, or because it's the law of God, which is a sufficient reason enough, or what's called the probable conscience, which involves a reasonable certainty that what you're doing is right or wrong, or what's called the doubtful conscience, in which, again, a person has equal reasons for doing or not doing something and isn't sure. Now, again, moralists for centuries have argued and fought over all this stuff, especially how probable your conscience has to be in order to make a choice. I really personally don't think there's a real answer to this. What we have to do is steer a middle course in conscience between absolute rigorism and absolute laxism about, what the teaching of the church is. Another very important point is that one cannot act with a doubtful conscience. If you're not sure what you should do, don't do anything. But it depends on what you mean, again, by sure. And I told you that the 16th century, because of Descartes in the 17th century, was loaded with people who weren't sure about much of anything, and they wanted certainty to resolve their doubt. People, again, can be driven nuts about this. Now, I think some common sense is really important here. Since many moral judgments involve a host of circumstances, and these are sometimes difficult to gauge by the ordinary person, an imperfect certainty is sufficient. In other words, mathematical certitude, 2 plus 2 equals 4, or metaphysical certitude, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts, is not required for moral judgments. Rather, what is required is what used to be called moral certitude. Now, I'll give you a definition of that from the Old Catholic Catechism, from Encyclopedia from 1916. And it would be something like this. Though almost any detail in these events may be made a subject of dispute, especially when we enter the region of motives and try to trace cause and effect, and though almost any one of the witnesses may be shown perhaps to have some mistake or misrepresentation, yet the occurrence of events, as far as I can tell, generally speaking, I'm certain about. Which is, by the way, what is meant in the jury trials by reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean you have to have a mathematical certitude or a metaphysical certitude where this couldn't possibly be any other way. It means that generally given the trustworthiness of events and people, I can be fairly certain that this is what actually happened. So, in order to act, you have to try to resolve your doubtful conscience. If that's impossible, because there's an immediate thing that must be done here and now, you do the best you can and just trust in divine providence. God gave you a brain, use it. And I don't know about what your experience is of religion, but I find that I'm amazed sometimes at the questions people ask priests. I was at a party the other day, and somebody said, a priest told me that I didn't fulfill my Mass obligation if I didn't go to my parish church on Sunday. I couldn't go to another church. And I looked at the person, does that make any sense to you? I mean, why are you asking me? Does that make any sense to you? Mass is Mass, and it doesn't matter where it's celebrated. That should be sufficient. But I mean, I realize that some of the more finer points of the law, that's why they need priests to help them with, But I mean, sometimes you just want to say, just think about it for a few minutes. And don't try to make yourself feel guilty about something you shouldn't feel guilty about. And, we have a big problem in Catholicism today. Father Buckley may affirm me on this, Father Francis. We hear confessions all over the place. And you either get people who don't think they have to go to confession, 10 years and I haven't done anything wrong, or you have people who just everything they did was wrong, and you want, well, wait a minute now, just hold on 1/2 minute here. Just think about this. Think about the commandments, think about the precepts of the church, think about those kinds of things, and don't get too complicated about the whole matter. The Lord must be up there laughing sometimes about our ability to form our conscience. Now, the last distinction I want to make here in this lecture is the most important one for today's world. And this is the distinction between what's called the right conscience and a mistaken conscience. A right conscience is one where the reasoning process actually corresponds to reality. In other words, it really expresses human nature. A mistaken conscience is one where there's something flawed, either in your understanding of yourself as a human being, your understanding of the law of God, or the way in which you've reasoned about this. The question is, if conscience binds as the law of God, if it's God speaking to us in the most intimate part of our souls, are we obliged to follow a mistaken conscience? In the Middle Ages, there was a great debate about this. Some people maintained that a mistaken conscience did not bind you because it wasn't true. St. Thomas was not of this opinion. St. Thomas said that since you perceive what you've concluded in your mistaken conscience to be the law of God, because of your perception of it, you're bound to follow it. Of course, it isn't the law of God, but you perceive it to be, and so if you were acting against your conscience, you as an individual would be acting against what you perceived God's will for you to be. Of course, you're committing a sin if you follow a mistaken conscience. So the question is, if I follow a right conscience, I am doing something good objectively. If I follow a mistaken conscience, I'm committing a sin objectively. To say that a mistaken conscience binds you to this, then, is it possible for a person who has a mistaken conscience to avoid sin? Because if you act according to the mistaken conscience, you act against the law of God. If you act contrary to the mistaken conscience, you act contrary to what you subjectively perceive the law of God to be. St. Thomas says this, "Moreover, it does not seem possible for a man to avoid sin if his conscience, no matter how mistaken, declares that something which is indifferent or evil is a command of God, and with such a conscience he decides to do the opposite. For as far as he can, he has by this very fact decided not to observe the law of God. Consequently, he sins mortally." Does this mean that a person with a mistaken conscience can't avoid sin? No, because you can always change your conscience. It is, after all, a judgment of reason. So you're not bound to make this judgment. You can always examine like if you're in the laboratory and you made the experiment and it blows up, well, we have to try something different, right? We have to modify our process of reasoning. Therefore, you can formulate the general principle that a correct conscience binds absolutely without qualification and in every circumstance. An erroneous conscience binds only by a kind of extrinsic consideration. It binds only in a qualified way and conditionally. And you know, you express conditions by saying if, then. If such a conscience can be changed, then it must be changed. If it can't be changed, the person has what is generally termed to be invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance is invincible because it's unconquerable, because you can't change it by your will. You don't have the moral ability to decide or to investigate what would help you to determine whether your conscience was mistaken or not. As a result, even though you're objectively committing a sin with a mistaken conscience, you wouldn't be guilty for such an action. Now, that's not the case with the other kind. If you can change your conscience and you refuse to do this, you have what's called a vincibly erroneous conscience. Now, what's vincible mean there? It means conquerable. It can be overcome. It can be overcome by your will. You have freedom in this regard. You can investigate things. You can find out things. You can consult other people. Or you can change your way of life to try to change your conscience. So if a person can know that his mistaken conscience is mistaken, then he's obliged to change it. The conscience binds as long as it remains, but it binds only conditionally. To change a right conscience is a sin. To change an erroneous conscience is a moral obligation. And moralists generally have maintained that when it comes to making a mistake, being an error, what's called ignorance, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. It's more like ignorance of a circumstance, where you didn't know this was going to be the case, or you made a judgment that was faulty about what the case, or something like that. When the error itself is not a sin, the conclusion is true, as when the error is due to the ignorance of some fact. Now, let me apply this a bit for you. Much has been made in the last few years concerning the fact that decisions about contraception in the Catholic Church should be left to the conscience. And unfortunately, this has been extended now, following this moral theory I told you about, really to almost everything. I believe that the moralists that began this moral theory didn't want to question every single moral teaching. I think that they were motivated by a desire to relate to especially the late 60s and early 70s in the culture, by permitting birth control, right? But unfortunately, they opened the hole in the dike, and by the time they were finished, almost everything was open to question as to whether something was right or wrong or not. And priests felt almost intimidated to talk about sins because it just turned people off. Everybody was just, we're all supposed to be, I guess, immaculately conceived or something like that. Now, the implication is that if a couple have consulted their conscience and they see that artificial conception is the only way for them to avoid certain physical or material difficulties, like poverty, for instance, then they're morally excused or even justified in choosing it. This opinion corresponds to the idea that conscience is a moral oracle, like the oracle at Delphi, that is almost, it doesn't have a real content that you can criticize or judge. Even the authority of the church couldn't criticize such a decision. Though a couple may be confused or perplexed as to whether a given act like vasectomy is contraceptive, and their perplexity may be increased by theologians who actively promote dissension for papal teaching in this or other matters, this still does not excuse them from the obligation to inform themselves and resolve their perplexity. And it's interesting, when the perplexity is resolved, or when the ignorance is resolved, often people have remorse that they did this to begin with. I have some friends, two guys and brothers, and we were sitting at the table one time, and the subject of vasectomy came up. And one of these people is a devout Catholic, and one of them has returned to the church. And they both told me they have vasectomies, and I looked at them and I said, well, that's a sin. It is. I said, duh, it's birth control. Can you have babies after you have a vasectomy? No. Well, duh, it's birth control. They hadn't been able to make that conclusion, apparently. That didn't enter their brain, Well, all of a sudden they said, yeah, that's right. That's true. It is. So then, of course, they were, nervous, to say the least. What I found fascinating, though, was, now I don't know if you agree with this or not, but one of the guys left, and the other one, they're very good friends of mine, and one of them said to me, Father, deep down we really knew it was wrong, but we wouldn't admit it to ourselves. Now, see, that's a place where conscience comes into play, see? But it's so easy for people today, because they've basically been told that their conscience is like an oracle. I have a right to follow my conscience. Well, Cardinal Newman once said, conscience has rights because it also has duties. Now, you know as well as I do that there's a total difference between the modern theory of justice and the ancient theory of justice. The modern theory of justice, I get my rights. Duties? Forget it. The ancient theory of justice is defined as the constant and perpetual will to give to another, not me, to another his rights. The ancient theory of justice is about the other, and it's based totally on duties. So that's why Socrates could make the remark that it's better to suffer injustice than to do injustice. Because if I suffer injustice, I'm harmed physically, but not morally. But if I do injustice, I'm harmed morally. Now, of course, if this false teaching, or the perplexity many Catholics experience, is due to their professors or pastors, or the people they had in Catholic school, then these people bear a much greater responsibility for the errors of the mistaken conscience. What would be the sources of sinful ignorance? Oddly enough, both Vatican II and the Catechism give some possible sources. Listen to what they are. Ignorance of Christ and his... By the way, this is a quote from Vatican II, right? We were supposed to have done away with all these things in Vatican II, right? And this is, I think, my memory serves, the most liberal document in Vatican II, which is Gaudium et Spes, Schema 13, the Church of the Modern World. Ignorance of Christ and his gospel, bad example given by others, enslavement to one's passions, assertion of a mistaken notion of the autonomy of conscience, rejection of the Church's authority in her teaching, lack of conversion of charity. These can be the sources of error in moral conduct. One whose conscience tells him to commit fornication is not completely perplexed, because he can do something by which he can avoid the sin, namely change his conscience. So when it comes to the fact that your conscience has to be your guide, the Catechism ends by saying this: the more a correct, see, that little word's really important, the more a correct conscience prevails, the more do persons and groups turn aside for blind choice and try to be guided by objective standards of morality. And you know, little words can mean a lot in theology. People will summarize stuff to me all the time from the scriptures or documents, and I always want chapter and verse, because little words are important. For example, when it comes to the Church's teaching on murder, on capital punishment, the Catechism and the Church generally maintain that the norm which can never be violated, the law, is the unjust taking, it says, of an innocent human life. That word innocent is an extremely important word there, and it is often omitted completely from the discussion. Two more points must be emphasized about the conscience. The fact that your conscience is invincibly erroneous, and in ignorance you're not guilty of a sin, doesn't mean that the action that was done is in itself still a sin. It's objectively a sin. It can't be a virtuous deed. It remains an alien body in the moral life, neither good nor evil, but an area of the moral life which cannot lead you to heaven or contrary to it. This is because the will is not present in it. As a result, resolution of the ignorance is an important obligation on the part of others. For example, a person who might experience great difficulties, have a sexual neurosis, for the therapist to permit a sexually evil action, for the person who entered into one ignorantly, where they couldn't resolve their ignorance, is one thing. But a part of the therapy of a sexual therapist has to be to resolve the ignorance in this regard with flawless explanation of the teaching of the Church concerning these things. So teaching is extremely important here, and I don't think some therapists actually believe that. If it is true for invincible ignorance, it is even more true for vincible ignorance. This is often caused, we often have an ignorance about what we should do that we've caused ourselves by our own sins. It's compounded by repeated sin, so that a person becomes what they love, and they change their value system so that an apparent good becomes for them a real evil, and a real good becomes an apparent evil for them. This ignorance can often be imputed to personal responsibility. Such is the case, again, the Catechism says, and again quoting Vatican II, when a man takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. In such cases, the person is culpable for the sin he commits. Now, the second other point I'd like to emphasize before I conclude my little talk. There's been much discussion today about the right of a Catholic to dissent from papal teaching. And what is often used in this regard is the reference to the so-called freedom of religion taught by Vatican II's document, Dignitatis Humanae. From the outset, it's important to keep clear that though there is a freedom of conscience in embracing the truth, This is not true regarding what constitutes the truth itself, and especially the religious truth in relation to the society of the church. So in other words, you have to remain free to make a sense of faith. You can't be coerced to do that by an external force. On the other hand, what the truth is, that's not a subject of discussion because it's objective. So, you know, before Vatican II, in fact, in the Syllabus of Errors, religious freedom is condemned by Pius IX. But what is he talking about there? He's talking about the freedom to determine what the truth is. In other words, whether there's a true religion or not. The error Pius IX was arguing against was what's called indifferentism, which is taught by the Masonic order, by the way, that every religion is equally true. Right? No, we believe there's one true faith, and that can't be subject to your freedom of conscience. All right? The right that's taught in Vatican II is the right to embrace this truth without coercion, and especially coercion on the part of the state. The state, although the church for many centuries bought into the confessional state, and I personally believe that the confessional state was a result of Protestantism, where the church became replaced by the state. The state really has no competence in the order of religion. They can decide that certain religious practices are contrary to the natural law and harmful to the state, for example, like infant sacrifice or something like that. But when it comes to determining which religion is true or not, or whether you can practice religion or not, the state has no authority, really, in that regard. And that's why in Vatican II, as a result of the Nazis and the totalitarian states, the church was trying to defend our right to embrace our religion, something which is becoming quite challenged, apparently, in our own country, even today. So the religious freedom that's advocated in Vatican II is about a freedom of the will to choose the truth. The religious freedom that's condemned by Pius IX in the 19th century is what the truth is, not how you embrace it or something like that. Leo XIII in the last century made this distinction. He said, another liberty is widely advocated, namely liberty of conscience. If by this is meant that everyone as he chooses worship God or not, this is sufficiently refuted by the arguments adduced. But it may also taken to mean that every man in the state may follow the will of God, and from a consciousness of duty and free from every obstacle, obey his commands. This indeed is true liberty, a liberty worthy of the sons of God. And also, Vatican II did not invoke the right to religious freedom of conscience in the ecclesiastical order. The document in question, which is often quoted, says this: so while their religious freedom men demand in fulfilling their obligations to worship God has to do with freedom from coercion in civil society, the state, it leaves intact the traditional Catholic teaching on the moral duty of individuals and societies toward the true religion and the one Church of Christ. So the freedom of conscience cannot certainly be invoked against authentic teachings of the magisterium to justify dissent from papal teaching. There is no such right. We have a duty to obey papal teaching if we're Catholics. In the civil order, there's a freedom from coercion, but the moral coercion nonetheless remains in both the church and the state to seek the truth insofar as we can know it. And so Thomas More's famous line, which we really need to keep in mind big time today, is when statesmen forsake their private conscience for the sake of their public duty, they lead their country on a short route to chaos, because what they're actually saying is that the civil laws don't have to be based on the objective moral order. I know this was a heavy talk, but do you have any questions or comments to make?
Listening to news all day long, there's been a great deal of discussion about Obama's recent decision that
All I would say on that subject is that the bishops have made themselves very clear, finally, on this, that we cannot submit to this. That for us to fund, to use funds from our collections to pay for medical insurance that would fund what we consider to be moral evil is something that we have to dissent from. Several of the bishops have said that. I mean, I don't know if you've read that, but many of the bishops have put out letters about that just this week. So, you know, the bishops, who are not always united at all in their discussions of politics, and you know, that's up to them, but they're very clear on what the moral implications are of this for Catholicism. So I don't know what the solution will be myself, but
What is our bishop's suggesting?
I don't know about him, but I don't read Bishop Listecki's letter, who's the Archbishop of Milwaukee. I understand the military ordinariate bishops had a letter that they were to be read to all the servicemen, but the Army forbid it to be read there. And then when they allowed it to be read, they excised a certain portion of it about civil disobedience. This is a big problem, and you just should be aware that, yeah, so, yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Yes.
I was going to say, to his credit, Archbishop Mullady wrote a letter which is, you know, kind of down the line with the rest of them.
Oh, good, yeah. No, the bishops are pretty much united on this. And it takes a lot to unite the bishops on certain things, but they're pretty much united on this, yes.
Who's the moral theologian?
Oh, he's retired now. He may even be dead. Richard McCormick. Yeah, he's retired now, I think, yeah. Gee, no questions. Boy, it must have been really clear, or clear as mud, right? One or the other. Can't ask questions. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just wonder, I mean, I followed a lot of what you said. It's very fascinating to me, but it is, you know, a lot of information, and makes me think of that one class I took in logic in college way back when. But regarding this current topic, what's been fascinating to me, and again, I don't know a lot about it yet, is that the commentators, the pundits, so often will say, in response to this, the Catholic Church, the bishops are saying is morally against our tenets and something we cannot do. Their response is, well, 70% or whatever that percent of Catholics use birth control, and to me that's like a specious. I was just wondering if you comment on the flawed logic, or am I the one who's flawed here? Because to me that doesn't really, in fact, some Catholics may not be following the tenets, doesn't speak to the laws of the Church per se.
Well, I think I would put it even more deeply. Because there are people that commit sins doesn't mean there isn't a moral law. And because people disagree on what the moral, you know, they want to pick and choose. And part of it's because of this theory. Now, you probably never heard of this theory. But believe me, this consequentialist deal reigned supreme in seminaries, Roman universities, for, I would say, from 1972 until John Paul II finally wrote that encyclical in 1996 or so. And you should have read the reactions to that encyclical. Bernard Herring, who is one of the principal moralists after Vatican II, he was a Redemptorist, the premier professor at the Redemptorist University in Rome, wrote an article in the London Tablet reacting to this encyclical. Part of what I was quoting was Splendor of Truth. As I read through this papal encyclical, I suffered tremors of the brain and looked forward to leaving the church on earth for the church in heaven. All the Pope is doing is showing distrust in us because he won't finally admit he was wrong on contraception. And the contraception isn't even mentioned in the encyclical. What's mentioned is the fact that there are moral absolutes. There are some acts which it is always morally wrong to choose. And that was completely undercut by this theory. I mean, you have no idea. When I was interviewed once on Fox News about the pedophilia crisis, I said this. Look, I'm not justifying this. It's a terrible thing the church did. But you know, for 30 years in our Catholic institutions, we have never taught that there is something that's always morally evil. There's always some mitigation with, well, in my conscience, I might need this. I can imagine a priest saying, well, pedophilia is usually wrong 99% of the time, but I might need this, so for me it might be right. Because we've had these little things you could get out of, and especially when it came to sexual ethics. The people thought we were too fixated on sexual ethics before, and that may be true. But I mean, the way to get out of it was basically people just said, don't worry about it, period, whatever happens. Well, that was just as bad as the other. You know, too much laxism is as bad as too much rigorism. And unfortunately, what it produced was, for a long time, empty confessionals and things. Now, people are coming back. But John Paul II, when he finally drew the line in the sand, and the Catechism was very clear about this too, all of a sudden it began sort of haltingly to change back. But I know of a seminary where the moral theology teacher got up this last month and told them that birth control was not, contraception was not always, and he didn't mean, you know, you can take the pill to regulate your cycle if you're a teenage girl and not married or not sexually active, because obviously you're not precluding birth there or whatever, you know. But he meant what the prohibition against artificial contraception, he just didn't believe that it should be allowed. Now that's the big hole in the dike. And unfortunately it led to a hole in the dike about abortion. Who would have thought in 1968 that abortion on demand would be advocated by Catholic politicians? Or partial birth abortion. I mean, nobody would have thought that. That would have been their wildest dreams. Because every single thing then became up for grabs, and there's nothing that's always wrong. And therefore we shouldn't preclude it by law totally, you know. I mean, you wonder what's left. As far as I can tell, there's only one mortal sin left in the world, and that's smoking. And that isn't even a mortal sin. And I don't mean to just talk about sexual things. I'm talking about everything, you know. I mean, missing Mass and saying, Father, do you really think God's going to send me to hell because I missed one Mass? I said, well, it's possible. You know, it is a divine commandment after all. Yes.
So I applaud with everybody else that this should stand finally on this. There's a lot for them to get there, as you pointed out. My concern is sort of twofold. One is the action being taken is against Catholic or religious institutions such as colleges, for example, that have non-Catholic employees and serve non-Catholics in their day-to-day business. And that's the loophole that the federal government is using. And so we're more narrowly defining what freedom of conscience is in terms of moral obligations in our day-to-day life. There are two other concerns, though. You still have the problem of the small business owner who's Catholic, who will be obliged to provide health insurance to his or her employees, who won't be allowed to say, but we won't cover X, Y, or Z because that's incorrect. The other problem that I'm afraid of is a whole lot of Catholics going, what's the deal? Because, as you pointed out, for 40 years, the pulpits have generally been very quiet on this. And you haven't heard the bishops saying this is a moral evil.
Yeah.
And we're afraid of, and I know priests have been reprimanded for saying homosexual acts.
Oh yeah, I think in Canada you can be prosecuted for doing that or something. It's very weird.
So I encourage you to encourage your fellow priests to return to
Oh gee. Forget it. I don't ever tell the priests what to do. Nobody asks me anyway, so forget it. I mean, well, no, what I'm trying to do is help you to discern especially the difference between an erroneous and a correct conscience. And I think what the weight of my lecture was, and I know it was deep for some of you. By the way, it's in my book if you want to read it. Because then you can read it over and over again. But it's the importance of the formation of your conscience. And I really want to encourage you to form your conscience according to church teaching. That's the real bottom line, I think. But when you're doing that, you're rooting yourself in the objective order of the world. So just to say, well, my conscience was my guide, well, good, but it has to be formed, And the Catechism makes very clear, and I think this is very true. The formation of the conscience is a lifelong process. I still have to find out things. Oh, really? You learn something new every day about yourself or about the moral stuff. But the general moral teachings are pretty clear and evident. So, and we did this now because Lent's coming up. Yes.
But I like one thing is the word conscience itself finds itself conscientia, with
knowledge.
So it requires knowledge.
Yeah, you have to think about it. Yeah.
It requires proof.
And we love Catholics in confession, but Father, I missed Mass on Sunday. Was it your own fault? Well, I had a broken leg. It was snowing outside, but I still missed Mass. Well, you don't have to confess it. Why not? It's because it wasn't your own fault. I mean, you want to just say, through your own fault. Now, is that hard to figure out? I mean, in some cases it might be, but if you're dying in a hospital bed, it isn't through your fault, So anyway, now the pastor was supposed to be here, but I found this bag. Free will offering.
I said only because Father Brian always gives us a free lecture, so that's why.
Oh, okay, no free will offering.
Yeah,
okay.
Only when the guest speaker comes, but the bag is open, so it's
all right. Bag. Okay.